Alrighty, we're back. Read the end of chapter 20. I believe it's chapter 20. And we'll get into chapter 21 as well. So Yogi and Yash were clearing out ice, and they're up this ice wall to get to Camp 4. I was next in line, followed by the film crew. Holly, Sunjo, and Zopa. The climb was anything but quiet, with the brothers shouting, "Ice!" and Zopa shouting, "Faster!" 4 hours after we started up, I reached the steepest pitch, 50 feet. It might as well have been 50 miles. My arms and legs were numb and virtually useless. But the worst part was the air. There wasn't any, or so it seemed. Each breath seemed to yield only a thimbleful of precious oxygen. Maybe enough to keep a bird alive, but not enough for an exhausted 14-year-old climber. Dr. Wu had been wrong. There was something the matter with me. Yogi and Yash were already on top. One of them was manning the ropes, and I hoped the other one was boiling snow at Camp 4. We would all need a steaming cup of tea when we got there. If we got there. Holly, Sunjo, and Zopa had dropped farther behind, and I could still hear Zopa shouting at them to move faster. I was about ready to give up and head back down and go home when JR came up behind me. He looked terrible. His beard and goggles were covered with ice. It was a wonder he could see where he was going. "Thanks for waiting," he rasped. "I need to film you arriving. Give me a couple of minutes. Head start to set the shot." I didn't have enough breath to tell him that I hadn't been waiting. I looked at my watch, and by the time I figured out what time it was, JR was already several feet above me. Without actually thinking about it, I started climbing up behind him. An hour later, when I finally reached the top, Yogi hauled me up over the edge by my backpack, which I was sure was not the shot JR wanted. Yogi's assist reminded me that 7 weeks ago to the day, a cop had done the same thing to me on the top of the Woolworth building. I'd come a long way, and it felt like it. I spent a good 10 minutes on my knees, trying to catch my breath, until it dawned on me, again, that at this altitude there was no breath to catch. With difficulty, I got to my feet and stumbled over to where Yash was trying to boil water. Camp 4 was tiny, and to make it worse, there was a gaping crevasse running beneath the crest, which I'd read was getting wider every year. Some believe that one of these days, hopefully not today, the whole thing would collapse and the climbers would have to devise a new route up the north side. I looked towards the summit, which was shrouded in gray mist, but I could see enough to pick out the route along the north ridge and across the north face to the pyramid. It seemed like a long way from here where Yash and I were squatting. I couldn't imagine the three climbing parties trying for the top like that, like I did. My ribs ached from trying to get enough O's into my lungs to survive. I knew that Zopa was carrying at least 2 tanks in case of emergency, and I suspected that Yogi and Yash had a couple stashed as well. Sherpas do not climb without loads. For them, that would be a waste of effort. I thought about begging Yash for a hit off the tank, but resisted the urge, knowing it would defeat the purpose of the climb. Instead, I started to put together my tent, which seemed a lot more complicated than it had at ABC the day before. Jack and Will came over the top next. Will spent a good 10 minutes on his hands and knees puking. JR did not film this. Will sounds like me when I climbed. 45 minutes later, I was still working on the tent when Yogi hauled Holly over the edge, followed by Sunjo and Zopa. Zopa was shaking his head in disgust, muttering, "Too slow, too slow." He bent down to the two slowpokes. "If you climb like that above here, you can forget the summit." Holly and Sunjo were out of it and didn't appear to have the slightest idea of what he was saying. I thought he was being pretty harsh, considering Holly's lack of conditioning and Sunjo's recent sickness. He came over to where I was struggling with the tent, and I thought, here it comes. But instead, he patted me on the back. "You did good," he said. "You have a chance." That was like a whole tank of O's flowing into my bloodstream. Maybe he wasn't going to try to stop me from getting to the summit. Suddenly, the tent made complete sense. I had it together in less than 5 minutes. I got everything unpacked, the pads and sleeping bags spread out, and I started in on Holly's tent as she and Sunjo watched through dull, lifeless eyes. The burst of energy cost me. As soon as I finished, it was all I could do but to get to my feet. Zopa brought over 3 mugs of tea and made us drink them down. Get your stoves going, he said. I know you're not hungry, but you have to eat and drink. He looked up at the sky. There, it's going to snow tonight. Ooh, getting worse and worse, but they're at Camp 4. Insane. Insane what these people do. Alright, chapter 21 is called Arrest. Uh-oh. Zopa, the weather monk, was right. Next morning, 2 feet of snow. Sunjo and I probably didn't get 3 hours of sleep between us. He must have been feeling better, though, because he groggily offered to start the stove. The process sometimes takes 10 or 15 minutes because there isn't enough oxygen to keep the flame going on the gas light long enough to light the stove. I crawled out with our pan to collect some snow to melt and saw Zopa, the Sherpa brothers, and the film crew were already up, and it was obvious from the steam coming off their pan of water that they'd been up for quite a while. Zopa was talking on the radio. That could mean only one thing this early in the morning. Someone was in trouble. I glanced towards the summit through the swirling snow. If it had been bad down here, it was much worse up there. Yogi and Yash will stay here at Camp 4, Zopa was saying. If the weather breaks, they will try to get oxygen up to Camp 5. I'm not sure we can get them down to Camp 5, a shaky German-accented voice said. You must, Zopa said forcefully. There is no chance of rescue at Camp 5 or 6. In this weather, you will have to come down to Camp 4. You must leave Camp 6 as soon as you can. Do you understand? This was followed by a long silence, then a discouraged and quiet, Ja, verst ich. He understood. Zopa gave him a blessing in Nepalese and signed off. Are these the same Germans you did the puja ceremony for? I asked. Zopa nodded. The Italians are up there as well. What's going on? 2 cases of HAPE at Camp 6. If you remember, HAPE is high altitude sickness. JR answered. Maybe another mild case at Camp 5. 2 climbers headed up to the summit a little after midnight and haven't been heard from since. In this weather, that meant they were probably dead, or hypothermic and close to death. Maybe we can go up to Camp 5 with Yogi and Yash and help, I said. Zopa shook his head. You and Sunjo and Miss Angelo need to get down to ABC. Other Sherpas are coming up to help, but until the climbers get to Camp 5, there is nothing anyone can do. As soon as you eat, pack your things. We need to leave before the weather worsens. Because of the snow and ice, getting down the col was worse than going up, and it wasn't made easier by thinking about the climbers dying farther up the mountain. We passed the Sherpas coming to help. They were loaded with oxygen bottles and Gamoth bags. Haha, see, you pronounced it right, Gamoth. Their plan was to get to Camp 4 that afternoon. If the weather didn't hold them back, they would head up the mountain the following morning to help Yogi and Yash get whoever had made it to Camp 5 down to Camp 4. If the weather broke, a rescue helicopter might be able to get that high. But even on the best day, an airlift was dicey. If the chopper couldn't make it, the Sherpas would have to get the climbers down to ABC as best they could. We made it down to ABC in pretty good time, in spite of the snow. I think what drove us was our eagerness to crawl into our tents and sleep for 2 days. The camp was nearly empty. Sunjo was still pretty weak, but confident that he would be better by the time we came up. I was beginning to feel a little less surly towards him. This probably had a lot to do with Zopa's compliment the night before. I was pretty sure they weren't out to sabotage my climb. Pretty crazy, the ABC thing. So a couple of chapters ago, they really struggled to get the ABC, and it was just like painful for them at ABC. And now they're pretty comfortable, it sounds there. They just want to like rest there. Pretty wild. The next morning, the film crew members were all vomiting. It looked like they had caught the same thing Sunjo had. Zopa cut their acclimatization short and arranged to have them go down to base camp with another climbing party. None of them complained. I'm going to, Ollie said. Zopa shook his head. You are fine. To complete the acclimatization, you will need to stay here at least 2 days. She gave him a smile. It's over for me, she said. I have no desire to go higher than Camp 4. You could make it to the summit, Zopa insisted. She shook her head and grinned. Too slow. Not in me this year. I appreciate all you've done. She shook his hand and turned to me. What about that interview after you get to the summit? I may not make it to the summit, I hedged. I think you will. She looked at Sunjo. How about you? Will you give me an exclusive interview after you come down? Yes. I thought he was being overly optimistic, but I didn't say anything. It's a deal, and your grandfather is our witness, Holly said. It means you can't talk to other print journalists until after you talk to me. Call you in New York City? Yes. She wrote down several numbers. Don't lose them. Before she left, she gave me a hug. I didn't mind this time. In fact, I was going to miss her, which surprised me. If you ever get back to New York Peak, you'd better call. I will. As I headed down, JR stopped and shouted back to me to remember to use the camera. Just before dark, 5 climbers, 2 Germans, 3 Italians, and their Sherpas, stumbled into ABC, looking like they had been buried alive. Most of them had frostbite someplace on their bodies, fingers, toes, ears, noses. One of them had snow blindness, and had been led into camp by a rope tied around his waist. There was no doctor in camp, so Zopa and Gulu, who had stayed behind with his yak so he could sneak Sunjo back into base camp, did their best treating their injuries. When they finished, it was clear that 3 of the climbers were not going to make it down to base camp on their own. The other 2 German climbers who were not going to make it down at all. They had died at Camp 6 2 hours after Zopa talked to the distraught German climber the previous day. 4 dead, assuming the 2 climbers headed to the summit didn't make it, which was a pretty good assumption at this point. It's hard to think straight at that altitude, but I had enough feeling in my oxygen-starved brain to feel a little shame over the way I'd been thinking about Sunjo. Climbing Everest is not a competition, it's life and death. The surviving climbers at Camp 6 headed down to Camp 5. Yogi and Yash were helping them haul the climber with mild hape to Camp 4. Those who could would have made their way to ABC. Those who could would have to make their way to ABC the next day. Zopa radioed Josh and told him what was going on. We have a chopper here with a Chinese pilot willing to take a risk, Josh said, but the weather is going to have to get a lot better up there before he can give it a shot. Do you think it might clear before dark? Zopa did not have to look. Visibility was down to about 20 feet. Negative, he answered. Then we'll have to wait until tomorrow. Any idea when the climbers from Camp 4 will make it down to ABC? No, but we will. Sorry, guys. No, but we will go up to meet them. Early afternoon, I hope. The chopper is small, Josh said. It will only hold 4 people aside from the pilot and Captain Sheck. You have to choose to get a ride and who goes down on their own 2 feet. Captain Sheck is coming. That's what I hear. He's still looking for that kid. Why? The boy left. He is certainly not up here. I told Sheck that, but apparently he doesn't believe it. He searched the Porter camp yesterday, and today he has soldiers checking everyone coming down to base camp. I guess he can do what he wants, Zopa said, but I could see he was worried. So was Sunjo. I wasn't sure how they were going to get him back down to the Porter camp. Gulu's yak had eaten its hay, so there was nothing for Sunjo to hide under. Captain Sheck checking climbers was not good news, nor was his search of the Porter camp. We have a lot of injured climbers up here, Zopa continued. We could use the room in that helicopter. I know, Josh said. I'll talk to Captain Sheck again. Maybe he'll realize that taking up an empty seat might be the death of a climber, and the death would be all his fault. I'm going to pause it there, guys. See you in the next video. Hope you're having a great day.